Colonial America was a tough place to live. Survival was at the forefront of everyone's minds. If we keep this in mind, we can perhaps understand some of their customs, which to them would have been normal, but to us today are just downright creepy. Welcome to Intrigued Mind, where today we will take a look at 5 creepy things that were normal in colonial America. Number 1. Body snatching. Body snatching, or grave robbing as it was known on the other side of the pond, was big business back in colonial times. Therefore, as creepy as it was to dig up a body pretty much as soon as the last mourner had gone home was rather common. There was a huge demand for bodies so that the medical community could use them for dissection. Some universities would either pay some unscrupulous person, euphemistically referred to as resurrectionists, to dig up grandpa, or they would simply inveigle their students into doing it, forever condemning them to silence via their complicity. Resurrectionists could make good money doing their job. They could be paid up to $2 per corpse, which in today's money is equivalent to $250. The savvy ones hit mass graves to save on digging time and to have access to more bodies. And while we can have a laugh about it here and now in the present, it was no laughing matter for the families of the recently deceased back then. The wealthy were able to deter body snatchers by hiring someone to guard the grave for a few weeks, after which time putrefaction would have set in and thus the danger period for a fresh corpse was over. Other methods of deterrence including having metal bars placed over the coffin, known as a mort safe. Sadly for the poor, they did not have the means to put such keepsafes in place. Indeed, one poor child who witnessed a dissection through a street-level cellar window ran home to tell his father what he had seen. Having just buried the boy's mother, the father rushed to the graveyard to find that his wife's casket was indeed empty. Public outrage at this custom saw body snatching outlawed in 1854. Prior to this, the powers that be felt that the need for trained doctors far outweighed a family's feelings on the matter. Number 2. Mass disappearances. It's not so much that the famous disappearance of the English colonists at Roanoke in 1587 was considered normal. What is creepy about it is the way that certain people at the time reacted to it. Most notable was the attitude of Sir Walter Raleigh. It served his purpose to have people believe that there was still a colony at Roanoke, so as to continue his claim on Virginia for the English Queen. In 1590, 3 years after the colonists were left behind at Roanoke, Raleigh returned to the area under the guise of searching for the lost colonists. In actual fact, he was searching for the lost city of El Dorado and used the missing colonists as a guise for his expedition. Raleigh made the dubious claim that he had tried to land at Roanoke, but the bad weather prevented him from doing so. The disappearance of English colonists in the Americas was not uncommon in the early days of settlement. What is creepy, or rather downright cold, is the attitudes of men like Raleigh, who basically didn't give a crap about the fate of the 115 men, women, and children who had been brave enough to stay behind, while the others jumped on the first ship back to the motherland. Sir Francis Bacon summed it up nicely in his roast of Raleigh, who in 1597 wrote, "To forsake or destitute a plantation, once in foreignness, for besides the dishonor, it is the guiltiness of blood of many commiserable persons." Even more chilling is the whisper that did the rounds at the time that the colony had been abandoned on purpose, a scheme that had been cooked up by Sir Walter Raleigh's enemies in order to discredit him. Life was cheap back in colonial times. Number 3. Funeral customs. Funeral customs were pretty out there in colonial America. Epitaphs, for one, were next-level creepy. Take the epitaph of one Jonathan Toote, who died in 1777, for example, which is technically just a whisker after the end of the colonial period, but you'll forgive us for this, dear viewer. Composed by the good Reverend Bunker Day, Jonathan's epitaph read, "Here lies, cut down like unripe fruit, a son of Mr. Amos Toote. To death he fell a hapless prey on April 5 and 20th day, in 1777, quitting this world, we hope, for heaven. Behold the amazing alteration effected by inoculation. The means empowered his life to save, hurried him headlong to the grave." Rather than remembering the life of little Jonathan and the person he was, the Reverend used this epitaph to spread anti-vax vitriol. You see, Jonathan Toote had been given the vaccine for smallpox, but had died of the disease. Apparently, it was quite acceptable to commandeer the public's final thoughts of a person and use them as a political speech. Another creepy yet normal colonial American funeral custom was graveside courting. Yep, you heard that correctly. In colonial America, death and dating went hand in hand. You see, early on in the colonial phase, women were a bit thin on the ground, so to speak. The new colonies needed women to work alongside the men and to give birth to the next generation. So, when a woman's husband died, there was no time to waste, and all of the single men of the colony would come a-courtin'. Since time was of the essence in trying to secure the hand of the new widow, it was quite common for men to press their suit at the graveside, directly after her dead hubby's funeral. This may make us raise an eyebrow today, but when the survival of the colony depended on growing the population and men outnumbered women 3-2, it was likely a case of first in, best dressed. There was simply no time to waste. Number 4. Thinking that vampires cause tuberculosis. In 1732, according to a periodical published some 53 years later, a man named Paul Arnold had a vampire problem, in that they wouldn't leave him alone, and he eventually became one himself. The colonists knew this to be true, because when they exhumed his corpse, his body was too well preserved. Obviously, the only thing for it was to drive a stake through the man's heart, at which he let out a horrid groan. The modern mind might reach the conclusion that poor old Paul was not dead in the first place. It was pretty common back then for people to be buried who weren't actually dead. Maybe those body snatchers were onto something. There is nothing unusual about the belief in vampires. Indeed, the belief in vampires had existed in England long before the colonists set sail for the New World. But the old vampire legends of the past got a new makeover in North America. It is said that this was in part due to the presence of German doctors in the colonies, who taught the colonists about sympathetic magic, which entailed cutting out the heart of the vampire, burning it to ash, and feeding it to their victims as a cure. Added to this was the notion that tuberculosis, also known as consumption in the olden days because the sufferer had the appearance that the illness was literally consuming them, was caused by the vampire consuming their victim from the grave. Therefore, according to the laws of sympathetic magic, if a person had TB, then naturally, they were the victim of a vampire, and the only cure was to dig the vampire up, burn their heart, and feed it to the consumptive. Perfectly normal. This ritual reached fever pitch in 1793 when a woman named Rachel Harris was exhumed and her heart, liver, and lungs were burnt in the local blacksmith's forge in front of a crowd 1,000 strong. Despite being dead for 3 years, Rachel's victim was the wife of one Captain Burton, who was very much alive. And why would Rachel choose Miss Burton as her victim? Because she was the first wife of the good captain, of course. Number 5. Cannibalism. In 2012, archaeologists dug up the remains of a 14-year-old girl who had lived and died at Jamestown in the harsh winter of 1602. People called this winter the starving time, and one survivor, a man named George Percy, described how the survivors had slaughtered and eaten their dogs and horses. Cats and rats were fair game too for the starving colony at Jamestown. And who could blame them? Doesn't sound too creepy, right? Well, at some point, things did take a decidedly creepy turn when the furry friends of the four-legged variety ran out. Suddenly, the colonists were eyeing each other in a way that they never had before. Poor old George Percy went on to tell this lurid tale of how he and the other survivors would dig up a freshly interred human corpse to eat the flesh and drink the blood, whilst it was still nice and fresh. George Percy's claims were proven 410 years later when the aforementioned archaeologist examined the skeleton of the 14-year-old girl from the colony at Jamestown. Her leg bones showed signs of a very skilled butcher cutting the flesh of her calf from the bone. Her skull, which was found buried along with the bones of slaughtered dogs and horses, showed no such signs of skill. It appeared that the brain, tongue, and the flesh from her cheeks was taken by someone who didn't have such a steady hand. One small mercy in all of this horror is that the archaeologists were able to prove that this poor soul died before she was eaten. Colonial Americans had to be grateful for small mercies, it would seem. This brings us to the end of our list of creepy things that Colonial Americans consider normal but give us the chills. Wouldn't it be funny to know what they would have thought of us? They would likely think that we were creepy too. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.